Today, we're diving into a pretty radical way of looking at the universe. A new way to think about how everything, and I mean everything, from a tiny leaf to a massive galaxy, actually gets its shape. We're going to explore a model where reality isn't built brick by brick, but is instead instructed into existence.
It all starts with something you can see with your own eyes in a physics lab. You take some random powder on a disk, you introduce a pure vibration, a sound, and all of a sudden, these intricate, stable patterns just emerge. Chaos literally organizes itself into beautiful geometric forms just by listening to a frequency.
And that observation leads to a really profound question. What if that's not just a cool party trick with sound and sand? What if that's the fundamental way the universe builds everything? Imagine a reality where form isn't made from solid little blocks, but is instead sculpted by instructions carried on waves. All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the basic idea of a wave-based universe. Then we're going to climb what's called form's dimensional ladder to see how reality gets built layer by layer. After that, we'll check out the coherence control panel to understand how you could actually control this system. And finally, we'll see how you can take all this from wild theory to a real-world, testable experiment.
Okay, first up, a universe of waves. Let's get into the three core components. The idea here is that waves aren't reality itself, but they are the blueprint, the set of instructions for how everything gets put together. So the theory lays out this really elegant three-part system. First, you've got a central singular unit. Just think of it like a tiny little radio transmitter, a point of pure coherence where the original instruction begins. Second, you have the waves themselves. They are the builders, carrying that signal outwards. And third, you've got filters. These are just the boundary conditions of whatever system you're in, and they're what shape those raw wave instructions into the stable, recognizable forms we see all around us.
So here's the big takeaway. In this model, form isn't something that's just inherent to matter. It's not like a brick is just a brick. Instead, form is a pattern that gets impressed upon matter by this underlying resonant blueprint. The matter itself is just listening to the field and arranging itself based on the instructions it hears. So how does this system actually build anything? This is where it gets really, really cool. The theory suggests there's this clear hierarchy, almost like a dimensional ladder, that shows how simple mathematical patterns can inflate into the complex, solid objects we see and touch every day. It all kicks off in 2 dimensions. This is the realm of pure mathematical instruction. A simple wave equation, like a sine wave. This creates a flat blueprint, kind of like the nodal skeleton you see when sand forms patterns on a plate, or maybe like the basic vein structure of a leaf drawn on a piece of paper. And then that flat 2D blueprint gets pulled up, it gets lifted into the 3rd dimension. The system's boundary conditions, things like tension or electrical charge, they act as a filter that forces those flat instructions to inflate into a real shape with volume and curves. So that flat vein pattern, it now becomes an actual 3-dimensional leaf. But look, a 3D shape is just a snapshot, right? For that form to actually stick around, to persist, it needs the 4th dimension, time. Time is what allows for the constant, ongoing cycle of vibration that literally knits the form together and stops it from just dissolving back into nothing. Remember that star pattern on the plate? It only exists as long as the sound is playing. The moment time stops, the form is gone. And this right here, this illustrates what is probably the most mind-bending idea in this entire framework. We usually think of space as this big box that time just flows through. Well, this model flips that completely on its head. It says time has to come first because you need duration to have an oscillation. So stable 3D space is actually the result of these vibrations intersecting and repeating over and over again through time. Space is crystallized time. It's wild.
Okay, so if this architecture is for real, it implies something pretty incredible. We could potentially learn to control it. And not by, pushing matter around with brute force, but by changing the underlying resonant instructions that matter is already listening to. The way you get that control is through something called a coherence funnel. You can think of it as a 4-step process. First, a phase anchor sets the master beat, the rhythm that everything else has to follow. Second, something called time reversal focusing makes sure all the wave instructions arrive at the center perfectly in sync. Third, selective coupling acts like a filter, cranking up the volume on that unified signal while tuning out all the random noise. And finally, phase governance locks it all in, acting like a pacemaker to keep the pattern from drifting apart. This really highlights what a massive paradigm shift we're talking about. The old model, the one we're used to, is all about control by force. You push matter around directly. It requires you to be right there, and you have to micromanage every single piece, like building with Legos. But this new model, it's about control by listening. You don't push anything, you just tune the underlying field. It can work from a distance, and instead of moving every piece, you just set a global pattern, and the system naturally organizes itself into that shape. It's the difference between building a wall brick by brick and tuning a drum skin to get the shape you want. So I know this all sounds incredibly abstract, maybe even a little out there, but here's the most exciting part of all. This entire framework isn't just philosophy. It's a real hypothesis that can actually be tested with technology we already have in our labs right now. The core experimental question is just beautifully simple. Can we prove that systems build their form by listening to wave instructions? The key is to show that you can change a structure only by changing the resonant field around it, with absolutely no direct physical pushing or prodding of the parts. And to do that, 3 experiments are on the table, each one getting a little more complex, but all testing the exact same principle. First, with an inert disk. Can you literally draw a leaf shape in powder using nothing but sound and a non-contact filter? Second, in a fluid. Can you get little beads in water to arrange themselves just by shifting electric fields? And finally, the big one. With living cells. Can you guide the shape of a growing tissue using only a weak bioelectric field as the instruction manual? And here is the truly powerful prediction. The theory claims that the exact same control grammar, the same mathematical map, where a specific tweak in phase creates a specific change in shape, will hold true across all 3 of these totally different systems. The same math that draws a leaf in powder should, in principle, be able to guide living cells into a similar shape. And that brings us from this fascinating theory to a pretty profound final thought. If this is true, if form really does emerge from resonance, from the top down, it means there's a language that reality's architect speaks. And if we can learn to speak that language, if we can learn to write our own instructions into the field, what new structures, what new materials, or maybe even what new forms of healing might we choose to create?